Music hall is a type of British theatrical entertainment that was popular from the early Victorian era circa 1850 and lasting until 1960. It involved a mixture of popular songs, comedy, speciality acts, and variety entertainment. The term is derived from a type of theatre venue in which such entertainment took place. British music hall was similar to American vaudeville, featuring rousing songs and comic acts, while in the United Kingdom the term vaudeville referred to more working-class types of entertainment that would have been termed burlesque in America, originating in saloon bars within public houses during the 1830s. Music hall entertainment became increasingly popular with audiences, so much so that during the 1850s, the public houses were demolished and specialized music hall theaters developed in the place. These theaters were designed chiefly so people could consume food and alcohol and smoke tobacco in the auditorium while the entertainment took place. This differed somewhat from the conventional type of theatre, which until then seated the audience in stalls with a separate bar room. Major music halls were based around London and included early music halls like the Canterbury Music Hall in Lambeth, Wilton's Music Hall in Tower Hamlets, and the Middlesex in Drury Lane, otherwise known as the Old Mo. By the mid-19th century, the halls created a demand for new and catchy popular songs. As a result, professional songwriters were enlisted to provide the music for a plethora of star performers, such as Marie Lloyd, John Leno, Little Tich, and George Laybourne. Music hall did not adopt its own unique style. Instead, all forms of entertainment were performed. Male and female impersonators, lions comics, mime artists and impressionists, trampoline acts, and comic pianists such as John Orlando Parry and George Grossmith were just a few of the many types of entertainments the audiences could expect to find over the next 40 years. Music halls in London were the scene of important industrial conflict in 1907 with a dispute between artists and stage hands on the one hand and theatre managers on the other, which ended in a strike. The halls had recovered by the start of the First World War and were used to stage charity events in aid of the war effort. Music hall entertainment continued after the war, but became less popular due to upcoming jazz, swing, and big band dance music acts. Licensing restrictions had also changed, and drinking was banned from the auditorium. A new type of music hall entertainment had arrived, in the form of variety, and many music hall performers failed to make the transition. Deemed old-fashioned and with the closure of many halls, music hall entertainment ceased and the modern-day variety began. Origins and development. Music hall in London had its origins in entertainment provided in the new-style saloon bars of public houses during the 1830s. These venues replaced earlier semi-rural amusements provided by fairs and suburban pleasure gardens such as Vauxhall Gardens and the Cremorne Gardens. These latter became subject to urban development and became fewer and less popular. The saloon was a room where for an admission fee or a greater price at the bar, singing, dancing, drama or comedy was performed. The most famous London saloon of the early days was the Grecian Saloon, established in 1825 at the Eagle, 2 Shepherdess Walk, off the City Road in East London. According to John Hollingshead, proprietor of the Gaiety Theatre, London, this establishment was the father and mother, the dry and wet nurse of the music hall, later known as the Grecian Theatre. It was here that Marie Lloyd made her D.E. acute BUT at the age of 14 in 1884. It is still famous because of an English nursery rhyme, with the somewhat mysterious lyrics, "Up and down the city road, in and out the eagle, that's the way the money goes, pop goes the weasel." Another famous song and supper room of this period was Evans' Music and Supper Rooms, 43 King Street, Covent Garden, established in the 1840s by W. H. Evans. This venue was also known as Evans' Late Joy's, Joy being the name of the previous owner. Other song and supper rooms included the Coal Hole in the Strand, the Cider Cellars in Maiden Lane, Covent Garden, and the Mogul Saloon in Drury Lane. The music hall as we know it developed from such establishments during the 1850s and were built in and on the grounds of public houses. Such establishments were distinguished from theatres by the fact that in a music hall you would be seated at a table in the auditorium and could drink alcohol and smoke tobacco whilst watching the show. In a theatre, by contrast, the audience was seated in stalls and there was a separate bar room. An exception to this rule was the Britannia Theatre, Hoxton, which somehow managed to evade this regulation and served drinks to its customers. Though a theatre rather than a music hall, this establishment later hosted music hall variety acts. Early music halls, the establishment often regarded as the first true music hall, was the Canterbury, 143 Westminster Bridge Road, Lambeth, built by Charles Morton, afterwards dubbed the father of the halls, on the site of a skittle alley next to his pub, the Canterbury Tavern. It opened on the 17th of May 1852 and was described by the musician and author Benny Green as being the most significant date in all the history of music hall. The hall looked like most contemporary pub concert rooms, but its replacement in 1854 was of then unprecedented size. It was further extended in 1859, later rebuilt as a variety theatre and finally destroyed by bombing in 1942. Another early music hall was the Middlesex, Drury Lane, popularly known as the Old Mo. It was built on the site of the Mogul Saloon. Later converted into a theatre, it was demolished in 1965. The new London Theatre stands on its site. Several large music halls were built in the East End. These included the London Music Hall, otherwise known as the Shoreditch Empire, 95 to 99 Shoreditch High Street. This theatre was rebuilt during 1894 by Frank Matcham, the architect of the Hackney Empire. Another in this area was the Royal Cambridge Music Hall, 136 Commercial Street. Designed by William Finch Hill, it was rebuilt after a fire in 1898. The construction of West End's Music Hall, High Holborn, built up on the site of the Six Cans and Punch Bowl Tavern by the licensed victualler of the premises, Henry Weston, signalled that the West End was fruitful territory for the music hall. During 1906 it was rebuilt as a variety theatre and renamed as the Holborn Empire. It was closed as a result of enemy action in the Blitz on the night of 11/12 May 1941, and the building was pulled down in 1960. Significant West End music halls include the Oxford Music Hall, 14/16 Oxford Street, built on the site of an old coaching inn called the Boar and Castle by Charles Morton, the pioneer music hall developer of the Canterbury, who with this development brought music hall to the West End. Demolished in 1926, the London Pavilion, facade of 1885, rebuild still extant. The Alhambra, Leicester Square, in the former premises of the London Panopticon. This sophisticated venue was noted for its alluring cordoba and was a focal point for West End pleasure seekers. It was demolished in 1936. Other large suburban music halls included the Old Bedford, 93-95 High Street, Camden Town, built on the site of the tea gardens of a pub called the Bedford Arms. The Bedford was a favourite haunt of the artists known as the Camden Town Group, headed by Walter Sickert, who featured interior scenes of music halls in his paintings, including one entitled Little Hetherington at the Old Bedford. The Old Bedford was demolished in 1969. Collins, Islington Green, opened by Sam Collins in 1862 as the Lansdowne Music Hall, converting the pre-existing Lansdowne Arms public house. It was renamed as Collins Music Hall in 1863. It was colloquially known as the Chapel on the Green. Collins was a star of his own theatre, singing mostly Irish songs specially composed for him. It closed in 1956 after a fire, but the street front of the building still survives. Deakins in Clerkenwell. A noted music hall entrepreneur of this time was Carlo Gatti, who built a music hall, known as Gatti's, at Hungerford Market in 1857. He sold the music hall to South Eastern Railway in 1862, and the site became Charing Cross Railway Station. With the proceeds from selling his first music hall, Gatti acquired a restaurant in Westminster Bridge Road, opposite the Canterbury Music Hall. He converted the restaurant into a second Gatti's Music Hall, known as Gatti's in the Road, in 1865. It later became a cinema. The building was badly damaged in the Second World War and was demolished in 1950. In 1867, he acquired a public house in Villiers Street named The Arches, under the arches of the elevated railway line leading to Charing Cross Station. He opened it as another music hall, known as Gatti's in the Arches. After his death, his family continued to operate the music hall, known for a period as the Hungerford Gatti's Hungerford Palaces of Varieties. It became a cinema in 1910, and the Players Theatre in 1946. By 1865, there were 32 music halls in London, seating between 500 and 5,000 people, plus an unknown, but large, number of smaller venues. In 1878, numbers peaked, with 78 large music halls in the metropolis and 300 smaller venues. Thereafter numbers declined due to stricter licensing restrictions imposed by the Metropolitan Board of Works and LCC, and because of commercial competition between popular large suburban halls and the smaller venues, which put the latter out of business. Variety theatre. A new era of variety theatre was developed by the rebuilding of the London Pavilion in 1885. Contemporary accounts noted, hitherto the halls had borne unmistakable evidence of their origins, but the last vestiges of their old connections were now thrown aside, and there emerged in all the splendour of the new-born glory. The highest efforts of the architect, the designer and the decorator were enlisted in the service, and the gaudy and tawdry music hall of the past gave way to the resplendent theatre of varieties of the present day, with its classic exterior of marble and freestone, its lavishly appointed auditorium and its elegant and luxurious foyers and promenades brilliantly illuminated by myriad electric lights. One of the most famous of these new palaces of pleasure in the West End was the Empire, Leicester Square, built as a theatre in 1884 but acquiring a music hall licence in 1887. Like the nearby Alhambra, this theatre appealed to the men of leisure by featuring alluring ballet dances and had a notorious promenade which was the resort of courtesans. Another spectacular example of the new variety theatre was the Tivoli in the Strand, built 1888-90 in an eclectic neo-Romanesque style with Baroque and Moorish Indian embellishments. The Tivoli became a brand name for music halls all over the British Empire. During 1892, the Royal English Opera House, which had been a financial failure in Shaftesbury Avenue, applied for a music hall license and was converted by Walter Emden into a head music hall and renamed the Palace Theatre of Varieties, managed by Charles Morton, denied by the newly created LCC permission to construct the promenade, which was such a popular feature of the Empire and Alhambra. The palace compensated in the way of adult entertainment by featuring apparently nude women in tableaux vivants, though the concerned LCC hastened to reassure patrons that the girls who featured in these displays were actually wearing flesh-toned body stockings and were not naked at all. One of the grandest of these new halls was the Coliseum Theatre, built by Oswald Stoll in 1904 at the bottom of St Martin's Lane. This was followed by the London Palladium in Little Argyle Street. Both were designed by the prolific Frank Matcham. As music hall grew in popularity and respectability, and as the licensing authorities exercised ever firmer regulation, the original arrangement of a large hall with tables at which drink was served changed to that of a drink-free auditorium. The acceptance of music hall as a legitimate cultural form was established by the first Royal Variety performance before King George V during 1912, at the Palace Theatre. However, consistent with this new respectability, the best-known music hall entertainer of the time, Marie Lloyd, was not invited, being deemed too saucy for presentation to the monarchy. Music Hall War of 1907. The development of syndicates controlling a number of theatres, such as the Stoll circuit, increased tensions between employees and employers. On the 22nd of January 1907, a dispute between artists, stagehands and managers of the Holborn Empire worsened. Strikes in other London and suburban halls followed, organised by the Variety Artists Federation. The strike lasted for almost 2 weeks and was known as the Music Hall War. It became extremely well known, and was advocated enthusiastically by the main spokesmen of the trade union and labour movement, Ben Tillett and Keir Hardie for example. Picket lines were organised outside the theatres by the artistes, while in the provinces theatre management attempted to oblige artistes to sign a document promising never to join a trade union. The strike ended in arbitration, which satisfied most of the main demands, including a minimum wage and maximum working week for musicians. Several music hall entertainers such as Marie Dainton, Marie Lloyd, Arthur Roberts, Joe Elvin and Gus Elin were strong advocates of the strike, though they themselves earned enough not to be concerned personally in a material sense. Lloyd explained her advocacy. "We can dictate our own terms. We are fighting not for ourselves, but for the poorer members of the profession earning 30 shillings to £3 a week. For this, they have to do double turns, and now matters have been added as well. These poor things have been compelled to submit to unfair terms of employment, and I mean to back up the Federation in whatever steps are taken." The pressure for greater rewards for music hall songwriters resulted in the application of copyright law to musical compositions. This in turn increased the profitability of the music publication industry and the sale of music in printed form. The music publishers at the time were large, extremely profitable companies. They sold the right to sing songs to particular artists, and no other person had the right to sing the songs in public. Recruiting World War I may have been the high watermark of music hall popularity. The artists and composers threw themselves into rallying public support and enthusiasm for the war effort. Patriotic music hall compositions such as "Keep the Home Fires Burning," "Pack Up Your Troubles," "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," and "We Don't Want to Lose You" were sung by music hall audiences, and sometimes by soldiers in the train. trenches. Many songs promoted recruitment, others satirized particular elements of the war experience. What did you do in the Great War, Daddy? Criticized profiteers and slackers. Vestigiles, I've got a bit of a blighty one, showed a soldier delighted to have a wound just serious enough to be sent home. The rhymes give a sense of grim humor. Tilly became more popular than ever during this time, when she and her husband, Walter de Fressy, managed a military recruitment drive. In the guise of characters like Tommy in the Trench and Jack Tar Home from Sea, Tilly performed songs such as "The Army of Today's All Right" and "Jolly Good Luck to the Girl Who Loves a Soldier." This is how she got the nickname Britain's Best Recruiting Sergeant. Young men were sometimes asked to join the army on stage during her show. She also performed in hospitals and sold war bonds. Her husband was knighted in 1919 for his own services to the war effort, and Tilly became Lady de Fressy. Once the reality of war began to sink home, the recruiting songs all but disappeared. The Greatest Hits collection for 1915, published by top music publisher Francis and Day, contains no recruitment songs. After conscription was brought in 1916, songs dealing with the war spoke mostly of the desire to return home. Many also expressed anxiety about the new roles women were taking in society. Possibly the most notorious of music hall songs from the First World War was "Oh, It's a Lovely War," popularized by male impersonator Ella Shields. Decline. Music hall continued during the interwar period, but no longer as the single dominant form of popular entertainment in Britain. The improvement of cinema, the development of radio, and the cheapening of the gramophone damaged its popularity greatly. It now had to compete with jazz, swing and big band dance music. Licensing restrictions also changed its character. In 1914, the London County Council enacted that drinking be banished from the auditorium into a separate bar, and during 1923 even the separate bar was abolished by parliamentary decree. The exemption of the theatres from this latter act prompted some critics to denounce this legislation as an attempt to deprive the working classes of the pleasures as a form of social control, whilst sparing the supposedly more responsible upper classes who patronized the theatres. Even so, the music hall gave rise to such major stars as George Formby, Gracie Fields, Max Miller, Will Hay, and Flanagan and Allen during this period. In the early 1950s, rock and roll, whose performers initially topped music hall bills, attracted a young audience who had little interest in the music hall acts while driving the older audience away. The final demise was competition from television, which grew very popular after the Queen's coronation was televised. Some music halls tried to retain an audience by putting on striptease acts. In 1957, the playwright John Osborne delivered this elegy: "The music hall is dying, and with it, a significant part of England. Some of the heart of England has gone, something that once belonged to everyone, for this was truly a folk art." Moss Empires, the largest British music hall chain, closed the majority of its theatres in 1960, closely followed by the death of music hall stalwart Max Miller in 1963, prompting one contemporary to write that music halls died this afternoon when they buried Max Miller. Miller himself had sometimes said that the genre would die with him. Many music hall performers, unable to find work, fell into poverty. Some did not even have a home, having spent their working lives living in digs between performances. Stage and film musicals, however, continued to be influenced by the music hall idiom, including Oliver Dr. Dolittle and My Fair Lady. The BBC series The Good Old Days, which ran for 30 years, recreated the music hall for the modern audience, and the Paul Daniels Magic Show allowed several speciality acts a television presence from 1979 to 1994. Aimed at a younger audience, but still owing a lot to the music hall heritage, was the late 70s series The Muppet Show. Music halls of Paris. The music hall was first imported into France in its British form in 1862, but under the French law protecting the state theatres, performers could not wear costumes or recite dialogue, something only allowed in theatres. When the law changed in 1867, the Paris Music Hall flourished, and a half-dozen new halls opened, offering acrobats, singers, dancers, magicians, and trained animals. The first Paris Music Hall built specially for that purpose was the place.British. It was followed by the Moulin Rouge, the Alhambra, the first to be called a music hall, and the Olympia. The Printania was a music garden, open only in summer, with a theatre, restaurant, circus, and horse racing. Older theatres also transformed themselves into music halls, including the Bobino Music Hall, the Bataclan, and the Alcazar. At the beginning, music halls offered dance revues, theatre and songs, but gradually songs and singers became the main attraction. Paris music halls all faced stiff competition in the interwar period from the most popular new form of entertainment, the cinema. They responded by offering more complex and lavish shows. In 1911, the Olympia had introduced the giant stairway as a set for its productions, an idea copied by other music halls. The singer Mastingwit made her debut the Casino de Paris in 1895, and continued to appear regularly in the 1920s and 1930s at the place.British, Moulin Rouge and El Dorado. Her risque routines captivated Paris, and she became one of the most highly paid and popular French entertainers of her time. One of the most popular entertainers in Paris during the period was the American singer Josephine Baker. Baker sailed to Paris, France. She first arrived in Paris in 1925 to perform in a show called La Revue Negre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées. She became an immediate success for her erotic dancing, and for appearing practically nude on stage. After a successful tour of Europe, she returned to France to star at the place.British. Baker performed the Danse Sauvage, wearing a costume consisting of a skirt made of a string of artificial bananas. The music hall suffered growing hardships in the 1930s. The Olympia was converted into a movie theater, and others closed. Others continued to thrive. In 1937 and 1930, the Casino de Paris presented shows with Maurice Chevalier, who had already achieved success as an actor and singer in Hollywood. In 1935, a 20-year-old singer named Edith Piaf was discovered in the Pigalle by nightclub owner Louis Leplay, whose club Ligoni, off the Champs-Élysées, was frequented by the upper and lower classes alike. He persuaded her to sing despite her extreme nervousness. Leplay taught her the basics of stage presence and told her to wear a black dress, which became her trademark apparel. Leplay ran an intense publicity campaign leading up to her opening night, attracting the presence of many celebrities, including Maurice Chevalier. Her nightclub appearance led to her first 2 records produced that same year, and the beginning of a legendary career. Competition from movies and television largely brought an end to the Paris Music Hall. However, a few still flourished, with tourists as the primary audience. Major music halls include the place.British, Crazy Horse Saloon, Casino de Paris, Olympia, and Moulin Rouge.